There are a lot of free services on Azure, but knowing how to use them successfully can be tricky. In this video, I'm going to show you how to get an Azure SQL database for free for life on Azure. Then I will show you how to create the database, manage it, and then connect an application to it. Now, if you want to learn more about Azure and how to use it safely and securely, I have a full course on Azure, and it's included in the Dev Pass. Also, if you want a copy of the source code that I'll be creating, there's a link in the description to get access to it. So let's jump right into getting access to a free Azure SQL database. So here is my Azure setup. And if I go to create a resource and I say SQL database right here, it's going to ask me a number of things. And one of those things is right up here. Do I want to try an Azure SQL database for free? So this creates a free serverless database with the first 100,000 vCore seconds and 32 gigabytes of data and 32 gigabytes of backup storage free per month for the lifetime of a subscription. So what it means is it's not going to be a heavy production database. That's not the point of the free services in Azure. The point of the free services in Azure is to let you play around with what's available in Azure and get comfortable with it so that when you use it in production, you know how to do these things. So let's go ahead and apply the free offer. So the free offer has been applied. We get the first 100,000 vCore seconds per month for free and 32 gigabytes of storage and backup. So let's give us a new resource name. I'm going to call this our free SQL. Now, a resource group is free. I covered that in the course, but basically resource groups are great for grouping things. Because what's going to happen is it's going to create a resource for us. But sometimes in Azure, you create multiple resources when you create one. For example, you create a virtual machine, it also creates a network and it creates a storage account and other things. They'll all be under this resource group. When you're done practicing, if this is a practice database, you can delete the resource group and it will delete everything inside of it. So that way you make sure that you're safe and secure and not creating things that are going to hang out there and run up your bill. Okay, so we need to give a database name. And so the database name is going to be DemoDB is fine for us. And then we don't have a server, so let's create a new one. And the server name is going to be Tim Corey Demo. And that is available. I will put that in South Central US. I am going to choose SQL authentication. This is a demo database. It's one where I test out things. I'll delete it and when I'm done. So I want the SQL authentication because the fact that I'm going to have a connection string in my app that will use that SQL authentication. You can use Entra authentication, which is the original Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. Now it's Entra. But I'm going to use SQL authentication for this because this is going to be what I want to use just for my connection string for temporary. Okay, let's say Tim for the admin, and then for the password, I'll do pwd12345 and dot, pwd12345 and dot. That P is capitalized. Again, I'm telling you this because I'm going to delete this, but this is a good demo password because it has an uppercase, a lowercase, and a number and a special character. So it hits all of the boxes. No, I don't want to save that. Thanks. Anyway, LastPass. So what we have now is we have our free database. So notice up here in the right, this cost summary is we have $0. So it's going to cost $0. There'll be no charge. And notice that the database will be paused automatically when the free limits are reached, which means that if we're trying things out and we're, doing a lot of demos and hitting it hard and we exceed or hit the maximum of what that database can do, it's going to turn off, which is good because it's not going to charge us. Now, what will happen next is at the end of the billing cycle, it will turn back on or be able to be turned back on because of the fact that we've reset the cycle. So now notice as well, this free database, there's only one per subscription. You can't just do this over and over again. That would not be cost effective for Microsoft and lead to some abuse. Don't abuse these things. But this allows you to create one database that is set up to work as a demo. Now, notice that you could enable the continuation of this database and you'll just be charged after you reach the end of the free limit. If this is a demo, I wouldn't encourage turning that on. So don't do that. And if you're trying to use this in production, that's not the ideal thing either. So there's other ways of doing that. There are cheap databases. You can get as low as $5 a month for a SQL database in Azure. But yeah, this will work for a great demo. Okay. We're going to say next to networking, we'll leave that alone. Security, the same thing. We're not going to worry about additional settings either. I'm going to leave all this alone. We're just going to go right to review and create, and we're going to hit create. This is going to create for us our free Azure SQL database in the cloud. Now, once this is done, what we're going to do is we're actually going to see how to manage it, how to get in there and access it, and then how to connect to it using C#. So yes, it's a database, but sometimes you say, well, it's sitting there. I'm not sure what to do next. And so we're going to get into that. We're going to show you how to actually do something with this database. We're going to create a Blazor web app that connects to this database and, it just pulls information on how to do the full CRUD actions. We're just going to do a read action just to show you that it does work. And how to connect it and manage it. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video while this updates. It does take a few minutes to create this database in the cloud. Okay, it has been created. So I go to resource, and this takes us to the database itself. And this is important to understand that there's two different terms you might be using interchangeably, and you shouldn't be. One is server, and one is database. So this is the database. This is where our data gets stored. The server is what runs multiple databases, but each database has its own costs associated with it. So you pay for the databases. The server is just the thing that kind of manages the databases. So we're going to pin this to our dashboard so we have it on the samples dashboard. Now, if we go back to our dashboard, like so, now you can see the database, you can click on it and go right to it. Now this tells us that overage building is disabled. It tells us the server name, the connection string, the pricing tier, the free amount of vCore seconds remaining, which is awesome. And one of the most important things to do first when you have this free database is set the server firewall. Because you probably, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe you don't need to do this because you're just working on Azure. But if you're working where you want to access this database from your machine, so you want to connect directly to it, you need to enable that in the firewall. So go to Set Server Firewall. This will take you to the server. Remember, this is the server, not the database. Okay, so this is the SQL server that runs the databases, and it has multiple databases. But then in networking, we can say, yes, I want to allow public access. And then down here under firewall rules, you can add your client IP address, that's my client IP address, and we can hit save. So this is going to update the firewall so that I can access the database from my local machine. So that way, if I'm using it for a dev server or I'm testing something out, that I can have direct access to it. Now, for a production database, you might not want to have that firewall rule in place because you might want to connect to it just from another Azure service, which is something that does not need a specific IP address, pulled out and put in the firewall rule for. Okay, you can just say, hey, yes, allow Azure services to connect to this database. Okay, so now we can go to Query Editor, The login name is Tim. The password is the password he typed in, which is pwd12345, period. We hit OK. And now we're in our query editor. We can actually run queries against, well, nothing. There's no store procedures, no views, and no tables yet because our database is empty and ready to be, created, to be populated with, some type of table structure and all the rest. So let's do that next. Let's actually start to work with our database in the cloud. So to do that, what we're going to do is pull up Visual Studio, and we're going to create a new project. What we're going to do is we're going to search for SQL. Now, if you don't have the database tools installed, I would encourage you to do that. To do that, you would go to your tools, get tools and features. And then in here, in the installer, what you're going to do is look to make sure that you have the database options installed. So data storage and processing right here. You want to make sure that's installed. So data storage and processing is going to give you the SQL Server data tools. That's a really nice feature. So back here, we're going to go to create new project. We're going to search for SQL. Notice that I turn my filters off. Normally I have C# filtered, but this is not a C# project. So I turn those all off. And now I get the SQL Server database project. So this is also known as SSDT, SQL Server Data Tools. We're going to call this our demo DB. And the solution name is going to be Free Azure Demo. Because this project will be for creating a database, which if you're not familiar, I have a whole video on SSDT, and you can search on YouTube for that. I have a course on that as well. That's in the Dev Pass as well. So I have content on this, but it's something people often miss, is you can create databases in Visual Studio, not just C# projects. So in this demo DB, I'm going to right click and say add. And instead of saying new item, I'm going to choose table. Now we're going to keep this really simple, and we're going to say person. We can say person or people. Singular versus plural is one of those debates that goes on. I can be convinced either way on this. I don't really care. If it's a person table, well, that contains multiple people. And you might say, well, that's actually the people table. But when you say person.firstname, it makes more sense than people.firstname. So we're going to say person. And in here, we're going to mark this as identity. This is one of the reasons I love this editor, because I have multiple ways of managing each row. So I can come in here in the upper left-hand corner and just type stuff and make some changes. Or I can come down here and type in the T-SQL. Or I can go to the properties window and make changes that way. So all these different options are available to you. And whichever way is fastest is the one I use. So just typing identity here makes this the primary key identity field. Now I can come up here and type first name. I hit tab and search for nvarchar, make it not allow nulls, and say last name, nvarchar, and not allow nulls. By the way, if you're not familiar with SQL and how to create tables and create store procedures and how to optimize your queries and test for performance, those kind of things, it's pretty important. I have a course on that in DevPass as well. DevPass is pretty awesome, not because I created it, but I created it because of the fact that I put all these different things in there that you need to be a great C# developer, because all these other things come into play as well. So I have I now have my table. Let's go ahead and create a store procedure real quick, just one. So in here, store procedure, I'm going to say sp person _ get all. And we're going to clean up the store procedure. And we're going to say begin, end. And in here, we'll say select star from dbo.person. Now, a SQL person is going to tell you, hey, you shouldn't have just a star because There's some reasons for it. Basically, it's returning a different number of columns based upon, if you've modified your table over time, it returns more columns, even though it didn't originally need those columns. There's also the idea that the column order can change and so many other things. But if I say select star from DBO person and then come back, right click and say refactor and say expand wildcards and hit apply, it now says ID, first name, last name for me. I don't have to type that stuff out. It's just done for me. That's one of the great things about this editor is that you can just, do these shortcuts and it works like it would in code as well. By the way, there's also find and replace, which is pretty awesome too. So that if I were to decide to make a change in person, I can find and replace that in store procedures. So really cool stuff. But there's our two. I could put those into folders, but I'm going to leave them alone. Just leave it at the root. What I'm going to do now is publish. And where do I publish it? Well, I'm going to go to local DB, and we're going to publish to local DB right here, which local DB is it's a simulation of a SQL database. It's not actually a SQL database. It's like SQL database files, but treats it like a SQL database. So I'm going to say this is the demo DB, and I'm going to save profile. I'm going to call this my local. And now, if you notice, I have this local.publish.xml. The reason I did that is because now I can double click on it and just say publish. I don't have to fill this out every time. What this is going to do is over here in my MS local DB, what I can do is I can expand out this one right here, which is my local DB / MS SQL local DB. Under databases, I have one database called Tim's Diner DB. That's not the one we're going to use. So there's no database in there besides that one. But now if I come over here to publish and I say publish, this is going to publish and it says, oh, no, you can't do that. So why not? It is a project which specifies SQL Server 2022 or Azure SQL Database Managed Instance as a target platform cannot be published to SQL Server 2019. That's because local DB acts like a SQL Server 2019. No worries. What you're going to do is go over here to Properties, double click on it, and we have, notice, SQL Server 2022 or Azure SQL Database Managed Instance. Just change that to Azure SQL Database. We're going to use both Server 2019 and Azure SQL Database. This will work. So we hit Save. Double click again. This is why we save this. We hit Publish. Don't get scared. You see that red X again because it published above that. So it keeps the previous history of what happened. So back over here, if we come to databases, we right click and say refresh. We now have demo DB. We have a table in there with a person. So our person table is right there. If we were to right click on it and say view data, well, there's no data in it. We're not going to do the full CRUD action. So let's just manually put data in here. There we go. So now we have a couple of rows of data in our local DB database. So now what we're going to do is, and I know you're saying, well, how do you put this into Azure? We'll get there. But first I want to do it locally, and then we're going to do it in Azure. So let's right click and say add new project, and we're going to choose a Blazor web app. And this is our database demo app. Sure, that works. .NET 9, no authentication. Yes, HTTPS. We're only going to use the server, not auto. So we'll leave it on just server. And sure, we'll include the samples because we're going to reuse one of the samples. We're not going to use top-level state. We're using top-level statements. We're not going to turn them off. And we're not going to enlist Aspire at this point. So with that, we now have our database demo app, and we can right-click on that and say set a startup project. And in here in our database demo app, let's right click and say add. I'm going to add it directly into my demo app because it's a demo, but I put this in a class library normally. So we're going to add SQL data access. So we also have to add, let's add now, a couple of NuGet packages. First one is Microsoft.data.SQL client. Install that. Apply and accept. And then we also want to get Dapper. So, oops, I didn't want to do that. I just clicked on Mark's name there. Let's install, apply, and now we have our NuGet packages we need to talk to SQL. So what we're going to do is we're going to right-click on we're just going to select this, Control-Shift-A, and we're going to say this is SQL data access, and put a semicolon here for file scope namespace. And now we can start doing some work. The first thing we're going to do, create a constructor, and we're going to ask for iConfiguration. Config. And I will create a sign-off field. I haven't modified my tooling yet, again, to do the underscore like I like, but it's not hard to make that change. I could make this I could take this right here and put it up in the class level constructor. I have not yet found that I'm comfortable with that just because of the fact that it doesn't mark them as read-only, which I really want them to do. And I could override that, but I'm doing the same amount of work then as if I just do it in constructor. So I have not yet gotten into doing that for my projects. Okay, let's write one method to access our data. So this method's a little funky, but we're going to talk through it real quick. I use this method over and over in all my projects. So if you've seen other SQL data access projects from me, you've seen this. Public async task list of T. And we're going to say load data of type T and U. And then I'll put on a new line, string stored procedure, U parameters, and string connection string name, and the default will be default. Okay, so what are we doing here? Well, first of all, this is an asynchronous method, so it's going to return a task of type list of T. So list of T is whatever type you pass in for T, whatever model you pass in, we're going to return a list of those models. Now, if you're not familiar with generics, I have in the C# master course we cover generics quite a bit, but generics, what we're doing here is saying, hey, you're gonna pass in these two types. I'm gonna use those two types. So if you pass in person model for T, well, you're gonna get back a list of person model. For U, that's the parameters. And I could specify which type for parameters, but I'm saying, hey, I don't really care. There's a number of different ways you can pass parameters. You can pass me a dynamic list. You can pass me the Dapper specific type of parameter list, or you can just pass me some other type. But I'm just going to say, don't care. Just give me a list of parameters. I will use that. And then the connection string name, by default, we're going to use default. Okay, so first up, let's create a using statement. What this will do is it will open up a connection to SQL, and it's going to make sure that this connection gets closed properly at the end. So using IDB connection, which, by the way, that adds a using directive for system.data at the top. So using IDB connection, we'll call it connection, equals new SQL connection. Again, it's going to add a new using directive at the top. Now for Microsoft.data.SQL client. Okay, and we're going to open up this connection. I'll put a new line and say _config.get connection string and connection string name. So we're going to put a semicolon at the end of that. What's this line doing? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to have a new SQL connection. So that's a connection to a database. And that connection is going to need to know what the connection string is. And so that parameter is actually this right here, which is a lookup. I could have put this in a separate variable and put a variable here, but I'm doing it all in one line. So I'm saying talk to the configuration, which we got passed in here at the constructor, get the connection string, and here's the name to show or to give you to look up that connection string. And by default, that is default right here. That's the default, but you could pass a different name in it and look up that different name. So that's how we're going to know what to connect to. That's putting it into the connection variable, which is an IDB connection. And that is using a using statement, which means that and notice it's got a semicolon at the end. We used to have to do curly braces here, and then it would close a connection at the end of the curly braces. But because I'm doing this in an inline using directive, this using directive will live until the end of the method, which is right here, and then it will properly close the connection to SQL. So this ensures that no matter what, our connection to SQL shuts down properly. So just make sure that you know it's happening. Okay, so now let's actually talk to SQL, which is, we're going to get back a list of T. That's what I want. And I'll say rows equals, and I'll wrap this in parentheses, await connection dot query async type T. And we're going to pass in here the stored procedure name, the parameters, and the command type is going to be store procedure. And then at the end of this, we're going to say to list. All right. So what this is doing is we're doing an asynchronous connection to our database. So we're querying it asynchronously. We're going to pass in the store procedure name, which is, in our case, is going to be sp person underscore get all. We're going to have no parameters, so we're just going to pass an empty parameter set. And this is a store procedure call. That's going to call a store procedure. It's going to get the data from SQL. It's going to get the data back. So that's what the wait is for, wait for the data to come back. And then it's going to take that data and put it into a list. What type of list? A list of whatever T was he passed in. So a list of person model or whatever we're going to pass in. That'll be what the rows variable has, which means we can return rows. And so now this will return our list of data. So that's all we need to do for our data access. Now we can do is go over to program.cs and put this into our dependency injection. And I'm not even going to do an interface because we're not going to do unit testing or anything else on this. So you don't need to have an interface if we're not going to do that. So we're going to say add singleton. And we're going to say that this is SQL data access, which adds a using directive at the top. So now we have our using directive for using database demo app. So we now have this in dependency injection, which means that we can ask for it, which is important because we also in here asked for things from dependency injection, specifically the I configuration. Okay. With all of that being done, now what we can do is we can come over to our components. We can go to pages. Let's go to the weather page. And let's just kind of take this over. And so what I'm going to do, we need a model too. Let's create a model first. We're going to call it person model. Again, at the root, I'm being quick and dirty here to get this cleaned up and done for you. So int ID, string first name, string last name. And this matches what's going to come back from the store procedure. Now you may say, well, that's a lot of work to do. It's only 3 properties here, but it might be 100 properties in my application. Well, first of all, you need to think that one through. Do you need all 100 things? Or maybe you're asking for too much. So that's one thing. But then also, this is going to be different based upon which store procedure you call. So, it's not like you can necessarily just have it be anticipated. So let's call this the list of person model. That's going to add a using directive for us up here. Actually, it's not, because it already has the using directive because it's a Razor page. Got it. We'll call this people. And yes, I know I'm making this code all break. No worries. Let's go ahead and get rid of all of the code right there. Get rid of our weather forecast class as well. And then up here, we have if people is null. And otherwise, we're going to say for each person in people, we're just going to take over this, this table. So person.id, and we're going to have person.firstname, and one last one is person.lastname. Okay, and then here we can say last name, and here we can close this out and say first name. We can get rid of this one and call this ID. So we kind of reworked this. So this is the people list. Okay, that's it. And we can call this people for our page title. Okay, so we'll leave it at /weather. I'm not going to try and break the entire application, but I just modified this page to ask for people instead. So now we're going to say at inject. We're going to ask for SQL data access and call it SQL. And then down here, we're going to say, this is already an async method. So I can just say people equals await SQL.load data. And we need a store procedure name, which is going to actually need to pass in first the types. So person model, and also we're going to pass in dynamic. So the store procedure name is going to be SP person get all. Let's go ahead and put this on a new line. SP person get all. And then on a new line, we'll say we need to have new as an empty string or empty object. Okay, so that's all it takes for data access to call the data access and get a list of person model using the SP person get all store procedure. So that's going to load our data and show it in this list. The last thing we have to do is come over here to app settings and actually set up connection strings. So connection strings is one of the few things in app settings that has like a default in the editor. So we can say default. And what's our connection string? Over here in SQL Server, if we, in the Object Explorer, we can right-click on the database and go to Properties. And then down here is a connection string property. We can double-click, copy that, come over here, paste it, and that is our connection string to our local DB. So with all of that being done, we should be able to run this. Let's make sure. We'll see if anything breaks. So far, it looks good. We go to the weather app, and Tim and Sue are loading now in our people list. So that's loading from my local database. So now what we're going to do is change that over to use Azure SQL, since we have an Azure SQL database. So what we're going to do is publish our database again. Now, this can be done normally through your CI/CD process. You can have something like GitHub Actions do this for you, but we're going to do it manually. So right-click and say publish. And remember, I didn't double-click there because I wanted to save a new one. So I am going to come over here and say edit and go to browse. I'm just going to fill it in manually for you. You could find it here in the list, but we're going to fill it in manually. But how do we do that? Well, what we do is go back to Azure. So back to Azure, we can close out of Mark's page here. Back in Azure, we can go overview for our database, and we have connection string. So we can, this copy right here, by the way, it's hilarious. I thought this would mean that it's going to copy the connection string without showing it to you, which I thought that's kind of cool. It doesn't. It copies show database connection strings. So just note that doesn't work. But you click on this, and it's going to show us our database connection strings. The cool thing is it shows us without actually showing us our password. So notice the password right here, password equals, and then it puts in curly braces your password, which you have to change. So we'll get to that. We're going to copy this whole thing, and we're going to paste it into our application. So let's come back over here. Actually, I can't click off this yet because of the fact that I got the dialog open. So let's just do it the other way around, which is the server name right here is timcorydemo.database.windows.net, comma 1433. Copy that and then paste it in here, server name. Select SQL Server Authentication. My username is Tim, that's what I selected. And my password is pwd12345. And we can say remember password. And the database, the drop down here, it finds DemoDB because of the fact we've already filled in the information necessary to find that database. It's actually looked it up. So we can say, yes, trust the server certificate, and encrypt. We hit OK. And now the database name is DemoDB. I'm going to save this profile as Azure. So now I can come down here and see the azure.publish.sql, and it's going to publish to Azure instead of locally. So you hit publish. This one might take a little bit longer, especially the first time as it connects to Azure and as it establishes that first connection up. So I'm going to pause it. I'll let it run, and I'll come back once it's done. Okay, so that took 43 seconds to do, but it is done, which means now if we come back over to Azure and we come back to our query editor, we go back and punch in our password. We ignore the creation of that. We go to tables. We can now see a person table. So the person table is going to be empty because we have not seeded the database with any initial data. That's okay because we can actually run a query. So for example, insert into dbo.person, and we can say first name, last name. Again, query skills, knowing how to work with SQL is a hugely valuable skill for a C# developer. Values, Tim, Corey, comma, and then for this person, we're going to do Scooby and do, because I want to make sure it's different than what I have locally so we know that it is, in fact, different data. So put a semicolon at the end. I'll hit run. That query has run. Now, if we select the top 1,000 rows from person, we can see that we have Tim, Corey, and Scooby-Doo. So excellent, we have data in our database. Now we can change this connection string. So let's go back to the database here and go back to connection strings. Yes, it's okay to leave that page. Show the connection strings. Copy this lower one, the ado.net with SQL authentication. We hit copy. We come down here, but here's where things get tricky because I really wouldn't even want to commit this to source code because of the fact that I have a connection string here which might be different for the next person. But now I'm putting up one in here that has a password. I really don't want to do that. No worries, that's where you use user secrets. Right-click on your app and say Manage User Secrets. And then what we're going to do is set up that same connection strings. And in here, we're going to say default. And I'll paste this new one. Let's make sure I can get, yep, there we go. There's that new one. By the way, it still doesn't have the correct password. Notice password is your password. So change that. And yes, that's in clear text, because that's how passwords work in your connection, in your like app settings and things like that, which is why we use user secrets and why we don't put them in a source control. Never put in a source control. So now it's in user secrets. I'm going to go back to app settings and delete this. I will leave it here because that way the next person knows, oh, I need a default connection string. And they know to create one, but they can put it in their own user secrets. Do not put it in app settings and put it into source control. That's a problem. So now I have it in secrets.json. It's going to override. Again, if you don't know about secrets.json, I would encourage you to learn about it. I have a whole course on learning about app settings and in the many things you can do beyond just using app settings.json itself. So again, also in DevPass. But let's go ahead and run this now with the correct connection string, the one to Azure. So all I do is change the connection string to be the Azure connection string. If I go here, notice I have Tim, Corey, and Scooby-Doo. So I just connected to my Azure SQL database using C#. So there's no real difference compared to local DB or a database that's in a container, a Docker container, which is also a really good way of doing things. So working with your Azure SQL database is not much different than working with a local database, as long as you have that firewall connection changed if you're working locally. So really cool of Microsoft to provide a free database to work with in the cloud. You can do all kinds of things with testing, with making sure you understand how Azure works and all the different settings that go into managing your database. There's some pretty cool stuff in here about database management and integrations and security and monitoring and all the rest you can get into. And you can practice all of this with a free database. And this database is free for life, meaning as long as you have that subscription, it's going to be free. And the subscription doesn't cost anything. So as long as you maintain it, you're good to go. You can keep this and you can work with Azure SQL and try different things out. Again, you only get one, but that should be enough for all your testing needs. You can keep deleting the data in it or even the tables and columns and start over and put something else in there and try out something else. But this gives you the opportunity to play around with a cloud database for free, basically without consequence. You can try different things and you won't break anything or have any type of charge that comes up, because it's going to turn off as long as you did the same settings I did. It'll turn off when you exceed the free services and then reset the next month. Now, one last thing that's important to note is when you're done testing. So this is important for anything Azure. If you're done testing and do not want this anymore, and you want to make sure you don't get charged for anything. Now, in this case, you won't get charged ever, but other services you might. So if you want to make sure that you're not going to get charged anymore because you're done, you're going to select the resource group. Click on this little link right here, and it's going to take you to the free SQL resource group. This resource group, notice there's a couple of things in here. There's a SQL database and a SQL server. It created two things, not just one. Well, if I deleted just the database, I might still have a server laying around. Now, the server is not going to cost me anything, but it's still the point of not having things just laying around that shouldn't be. So what you can do is in this resource group, say delete resource group, copy the name. Notice it shows you three things it's going to delete, actually: the demo DB, the master database, as well as the server. I paste in the resource group name here. This is irreversible. So make sure that you don't want to go back and go, oh, I did want to do that. Nope, too late. So once you hit delete, it's going to be gone. Make sure that you know what you're doing here. But we're going to hit delete. Yes, this is permanent. It's going to take a little bit, but now this is all going to get blown away, which means my database is gone. My free instance is gone. I can redo a free instance since that free instance is freed up. It's no longer a part of my account, but everything will be gone and no longer on Azure. This is a way to clean up everything and make sure that you don't leave anything behind that could have an unexpected bill attached. Okay, so that's how to use the free Azure SQL database in the cloud. It's pretty awesome. I would encourage you to check it out. There's more free services. We'll cover more free things about Azure in the future. But there's ways to use the cloud for free or for very little expense to learn, to even use in production in some cases. This is not a production one, but there's a lot of things you can do with Azure that keeps your bill very, very low and is more cost effective than doing it locally. So stay tuned. Subscribe if you're not already, because we have more content on Azure coming and how to do things for free. All right. Thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.